Huples Cat, welcome to Chapter 2 of When Everything Fails, How to Survive, How to Prepare. A great course, no sponsorship, but I'm kind of enjoying doing it, and I'm doing it half a chapter a video. So this is the second lecture and this is the first half of it. And this is kind of a cool one. It talks about disaster planning and bug out bags. This is my winter camping bag. I'm not going to go through it now. Pretty heavy, external frame. Most of the space is actually taken up with a winter sleeping bag. It's pretty important. Also a liner and an outer, a whole bunch of important things because it's cold here. Where you live, it may be different. Where you live, you need to put stuff in one of these that you need, not what I recommend or what I use, because it might be an entirely different experience. Anyway, let's get on with the show.
This includes building a basic disaster plan and assembling physical and digital go kits.
Go kits. Bug out bags, almost all preppers would have them, but an actually written disaster plan, written out and thought about in advance what to do for various types of catastrophe, disaster and local events isn't that common. I'm not an Excel sheet type of guy at all, nor I do even really label things very well, but I do see the point in having a disaster plan, and this was it. This was it for the area that I used to live in, and I think it's fairly straightforward. And you can stop it and read it if you like. It has to be very, very brief, very, very clear, and it has to be able to be used by somebody who's not a prepper, i.e. Kitty, while she's absolutely panicking. So like I said, I'm redoing it for this area because our needs here and things to do here with this type of a house, because this is passive solar, are entirely different from what I'd have to do in my suburban home in Newmarket, Ontario.
I'd also like for you to reflect about how you think you might have responded to this type of incident. It was January 6th, 2005, a clear night with the temperature at approximately 55 degrees. At 2:39 a.m., a freight train was passing through town. The track that the train was on went straight through the town, but there was a spur or side track that led toward a local textile mill. On this evening, the switch causing trains to divert onto the side track had not been reset from an earlier use. But the engineers on the freight train on its way through town didn't know that. In fact, they had no real reason to believe that would be the case, as the side track was only utilized when a shipment was specifically designated for the mill. Because the switch was flipped, the incoming freight train unexpectedly diverted onto the side track, where it struck another train that was parked there, and both trains derailed as a result.
Now, I no longer live anywhere near a highway or even a major road, and I certainly live nowhere near any rail tracks anymore. Nor do I live on a flight path of airlines, because airliners do occasionally crash. What I could face would be very, very low probability but high risk is a propane truck crash right outside of our property on the road. Propane trucks do use the road, and that's about the only thing that would necessitate an evacuation for me. And in that case, depending on where it was on the road, I'd actually evacuate into the forest if I couldn't evacuate out of harm's way.
The crash drew the attention of multiple people in town, including at the mill, which operated in the nighttime hours. Numerous 911 calls were made to report the incident. Some callers reported not only the incident, but also the presence of what looked like smoke and an odor that smelled like bleach.
This made me laugh. If you've ever done basic chemistry, and you should have done, you'd know chlorine gas, and you're going to get that out of there immediately.
Chlorine is a chemical that has many industrial applications and is frequently transported along railroad lines. Chlorine is also deadly, even in small quantities. As little as 3 parts per million in the air can cause significant irritation and difficulty breathing.
Actually, no, chlorine gas can cause blindness and death, so it's a little bit more than that. It was used by both sides in World War I with horrific effects, so horrific that even though they were slaughtering each other in the trenches, by the end of the war, the use of nerve agents and gases on the field of combat was outlawed and seems to have been stuck to, and was even stuck to during World War II. Bit of a PSA, an N95 will do absolutely nothing to protect you from chlorine gas, nothing. You have to get away from it upwind as fast as you can, and the only thing that you could have around toxic chlorine gas concentrations is actually a hazmat suit, a sealed rubberized full face, because eyes are a problem, with its own oxygen supply. Not a realistic prep.
When the incoming freight train was derailed, a 90-ton tanker car carrying chlorine was breached, and what witnesses reported as smoke and the odor of bleach was actually chlorine gas discharging. The local fire department and sheriff's office responded, and upon approaching the scene, personnel from both agencies noted the chemical spill and experienced difficulty breathing. They backed away from the location and requested assistance, including a hazardous materials unit.
In Toronto, some, but not all, fire trucks have Geiger counters, so when they approach a fire and it's radioactive because it was a failed or a successful dirty bomb explosion, they have knowledge of that because it's an invisible threat. There's low probability but very high risk in Toronto. They sure as heck don't have Geiger counters in any fire trucks up here. The message is, if there's been a crash on the highway or the railway, anywhere close to you, get out, evacuate immediately, and then find out if you should have evacuated or not. These things happen so rarely that if it happens to you in your area, just assume it's toxic. Assume it's the US Army secretly moving nerve agents. Get out. If you can safely get out, bypassing the area where the danger is, using upwind, get out.
A reverse 911 call was placed. That's a mechanism that allows a 911 call center to send a message to local phone numbers, a precursor to contemporary emergency alert systems that use email and text messages. The call told residents to shelter in place. That means to stay in their homes and not go outdoors. Shelter-in-place messages also may include instructions to close windows and doors, turn off HVAC systems, and other protocols. This is a fairly standard practice at the beginning of a hazardous materials incident, especially when all facts about what substances are involved and the extent of exposures are unknown.
Ideally, evacuate upwind within 1 minute of being aware of the fact there's been an accident or a crash that could involve container trucks. Where you are, you might feel safe, and it's local but not that close. I still advise getting out. Get out, bug out immediately upwind for any major truck or rail derailment in your very localized area, within a mile of you. Get out. If you're more than a mile away, monitor the situation and also monitor the weather channel. If you are downwind, you might want to relocate. Hey, you might spend 4 or 5 hours outside the home, or 4 or 5 days, depending on what actually happens. But you evacuate before you're told to.
Evacuations were initiated for the textile plant, which was immediately adjacent to the crash site, and a roadblock was set up around the area believed to be affected. In the morning, a mandatory evacuation was ordered for an approximately 1 mile perimeter around the crash site.
These people have been at risk all night.
And 5,400 persons were successfully evacuated. Sadly, 9 deaths resulted from the incident, including the train engineer, 6 employees of the mill, a truck driver who was sleeping in his cab in the area, and a person in a residence near the crash site. Another 554 persons reported to local hospitals for difficulty breathing.
First off, consider, is that hospital safe from this event? If it's safe to move the casualty to a further hospital that is more safe, i.e. more upwind of the area involved, or if it's a flood that's less likely to have been flood damaged, use that option. If you can, remember that if time is critical to save somebody, take them to the nearest hospital or even the nearest ambulance station.
The evacuation lasted from 7 to 13 days, depending on locations. Many persons left quickly, not knowing how long the evacuation would last, thinking it would be short-term, and in fact left their pets at home.
I hope if you've got kids you wouldn't leave them behind if you had to run out of the house. I certainly have no intention whatsoever of leaving Wolfie. I will do my best to get hold of Marmalade in the time allowed. That might be more problematic because she's beautiful and sweet, somewhat semi-wild, and is really distrustful of people getting anywhere close to her. Consider making a go bag for the pets. Make sure you have carriers that work and function for the pets.
During the evacuation period, first responders re-entered the quarantined zone to recover pets and successfully reunited several hundred with their owners. But 30 pets were found dead or had to be euthanized, and another 30 were treated for symptoms of chlorine exposure.
I'd really not cope well with leaving my pets behind.
Initial estimates were that this incident caused $6.9 million in damages. But there were more long-term outcomes. Some persons exposed to the chlorine gas continue to have long-term respiratory impacts, and some persons who experienced the incident report continued anxiety as a result.
Lake McGuinty in Quebec had over 40 of its citizens burned to death in an oil tank derailment, and that was years ago now, and they still have no bypass of the town.
Wiring and electronics in the area were damaged by the gas, and the textile plant shut its doors the following year, having been damaged itself and having an interruption to the necessary supplies being delivered by rail. The area still feels the effects of the disaster, although economic recovery is progressing with new industry and residential developments. Think about how you might respond to this type of situation. What would be your reaction when you heard about the train crash?
In Newmarket, where I used to live, I'd evacuate within 5 minutes upwind from the rail links, which I know where they are. If you're less than a mile away, you probably should just evacuate. If you're more than a mile away, you might want to sit and think. But while you're sitting and thinking and getting news and information, have a really, really good look around you and get ready to evacuate.
What would you do when you received a call indicating to shelter in place?
This one's a tough one. If it's local, I am fleeing immediately upwind. There are chemicals that are routinely travelling on our roads and rail links in North America and the United Kingdom and Europe that are way more toxic than chlorine.
Would you anticipate the potential need to evacuate?
Yes. Now I'm a prepper, so I'm redoing all our bags now based upon the fact that I've relocated from a suburban outer city environment with multiple people and lots of asphalt and lots of roads into an environment that has very few roads, very few people, and a lot of trees. What you're looking at here is the winter camping one. I've just put it together, I'm going to trial it out, and it has most of its space is actually full of a winter sleeping bag. That's really important. Now the car right now has about 2 weeks supply of food and water in it, plus a lot of other gear if we get trapped in place. If we're shopping somewhere we cannot get back to this location safely because of a radiation or a toxic event, we can actually camp out in the car or near to the car for a good 2 weeks. We can actually bug out from the car and return here because the bags are in the car. They're not separate from the car. The car has its own kits, the house has its own kits. You're going to need more than one kit. One kit is definitely better than no kit.
When the evacuation was called, would you be ready to go and to move out quickly?
Yes, I would, but I probably wouldn't wait to be told by the authorities.
Would you be prepared to live away from home for up to 2 weeks?
Yes, in the car, with family, with friends, in a motel, in a hotel. We have the cash, we have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the thought process ahead of time to make all of those options viable.
If you have a family, would your spouse or significant other be ready?
Now, Kitty gets prepping, but she would be reluctant just to pick up and move without any sign of obvious problems other than there's been a major rail crash we've heard and we see flames or smoke on the rail track. But it's really important to get people up and moving in the early phase. It can be a critical difference than hanging around and waiting for some cop to show up if they can safely do so and hammer on your door. The whole concept of staying in place and sealing all the windows with duct tape and everything else, I find problematic. I think for radiation events of large scale, it's an absolute bonus. But if you really try and hide in a modern house, this is a passive solar house. It's pretty sealed. We don't open a door or a window. But in most houses, if you actually try and seal it from outside and it's a neurotoxin, you're going to be inhaling it.
What about your children? What about your pets? These are not questions that we tend to think about in everyday life, but preparedness can help us.
If you can, add in any elderly and disabled neighbours and friends and family. They may need your help to evacuate them. Whatever you do, don't stand around and yabber on the phone or with your neighbours or the internet about what should I do, what is going on. If there's been an issue, and these things are rare, if there's been an issue, assume worst case and get out. Then get the information, then do the chatting, and you can come home, or not, depending on what actually happened. Waiting to find out whilst in harm's way is not a good option.
Are you ready to accept the possibility of a disaster? Are you ready to acknowledge, if you were in Graniteville, for instance, that something serious has happened, that it requires increased attention, and that it may disrupt your life for some time?
Yes, but this sounds a bit 12-steppy to me.
Are you ready to accept the recommendations from emergency responders that you need to take protective actions?
Yes. No. Depends. If I was in Abbotsford, British Columbia right now, and I was a farmer, or even if I wasn't a farmer, there is zero chance that I'm evacuating if I feel safe enough to cope with the major flood that's already happened from my animals. My animals are part of me, they're sentient, they deserve me risking myself to save them. So it depends.
If you have children, have you prepared them mentally for these possibilities?
I don't, but mentally prepared, think about it, act to get stuff and training to deal with it and practice it as reasonably often as you can, and also include your family and friends as far as you can. There's limits to this.
Routine emergency, disaster, and catastrophe. This categorization comes to us from E.L. Quarantelli, one of the foremost disaster scholars in the United States. But here's the essence of what Quarantelli said. There are routine emergencies, there are disasters, and there are catastrophes. If you will, for the moment, imagine these depicted as steps on a staircase, with routine emergencies at the bottom level and catastrophes at the top. A routine emergency is something that could happen every day, and with the exception of the persons directly impacted, whether victims or first responders, there's not likely to be a broad community impact.
Small house fire, car accident, heart attack, or a stroke.
Many first responders would correctly say, no emergency is routine because you never know what may happen.
True. In the hospital I used to work at, we had a small transformer fire because they wired it wrong, and it wasn't really significant. There was a little bit of smoke, etc., etc. Fire services were called and came. Within 30 minutes of that, there was a cascading electrical effect where we lost power for a period of time to a lot of intensive care units, and by the time we realized that was happening, it was the labs went out. Then after the labs went out, we lost locating, so we couldn't call anybody. And then we tried to use our cell phones. We couldn't use the cell phones because the cell phone tower for the area was on top of the hospital. We figured it out, but we sent somebody outside to get a cell phone from elsewhere. But the thing is, the cascading effects can happen very, very quickly. So even if it appears to be very minor and nothing much, just, hey, I'll get my camera and I'll film this because I'll get a good video out of it for YouTube. Consider how safe it is. Consider how fast things can spiral into a death spiral for you and your family. Get out. Think about it. The videoing is not important. The discussing about what to do is not important. An issue has occurred, act.
I'm using the term routine only to signify that it's the type of emergency call that would be expected to occur on a somewhat regular basis or to be resolved without significant community disruption.
Do you see prepping as a mission to provide public safety? Or is it just about you and yours? I see prepping as mainly about me, mostly about my family and friends and dogs, but also the wider community. There is preps that I have, because I was able to do them, that I would be able to use to help other people, even strangers, in a disaster. But there's a lot of caveats to that, and you've got to be very careful about what you do. It's always going to be situational, always.
A disaster is not just a big routine emergency, but rather is something different entirely. Disasters require significantly higher levels of response, usually multiple agencies with many personnel working together. Disruptions to daily life occur as persons are given directions outside the norm, like to immediately leave their homes. Organizations work together in ways they may not ordinarily, such as by having high schools serve as shelters, as was the case in Graniteville, rather than serving their usual educational function, or by knowing that some persons might be volunteering as part of a rescue and aid effort rather than reporting to their usual jobs, all to serve that public mission of providing safety. The Graniteville incident would qualify as a disaster. A catastrophe is not just a big disaster, but rather it too is something entirely different. In catastrophes, the infrastructure of an area, buildings, roads, levees, utilities, may be significantly damaged or destroyed. Local response efforts will be insufficient, requiring national aid. Everyday activities such as work, school, recreation, and others will not only stop almost entirely, but will stop for long periods of time, disrupting the very fabric of a community.
COVID-19, BC wildfire and floods, all of these are hard to prep for, but they're not impossible to prep for, and it's certainly possible to deal with, to some degree, with a disaster plan and go bags and other stuff. What is undeniably true, though people keep denying it, is that human-caused climate change is real and is accelerating. It's getting much worse each passing year. It's going to be, frankly, very hard to deal with. One of the interesting things I've seen online recently is people saying, I always consider going to Canada to survive the end of the world because they have a lot of water and trees and open spaces, which we do. It's also kind of cold sometimes and we do have bears. But because of the BC wildfires and the BC floods, they've now decided Canada's out of the equation. Canada is the second largest country in the world. The largest country is not America, it is the United States of Russia. When you live, fortunately, in a large country, really consider, you're very local in thought. My processes are mostly Ontario. I don't consider seriously going to Quebec to bug out. I don't think seriously going to Alberta to bug out. But you should have some thought process that. I have family and friends in Alberta. There is no particular reason why, if it was possible, we couldn't drive there over 3 or 4 days and camp out with them for 8 weeks or so whilst things were stabilising in the area we're in. Use your imagination. It's not just about bugging out into the nearest wild forest, because that's probably not going to work very well, or going to the nearest small town, because that's traditionally how evacuations happen. Think longer term. Like if you're able to and you have the finance of family and friends, but it's a 250-mile car ride, and the nearest small town's 15 miles away, and your small town's been put in evacuation notice, rather than go the 15 mile away, which could then tomorrow or the next day also have to be evacuated, consider just jumping the distance and going to somewhere that's definitely safe from this event and riding it out.
Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in 2005, was an example of a catastrophe. Plans have to take this into account. Responders need to know they'll have to work together with regional partners and ask residents to temporarily disrupt their activities in a disaster. And they need to know that catastrophes may require a full rethinking of how response and social necessities are provided. You need to know that too.
And I'd argue so do we. We need to prep for all 3 types. Most of us prep for 1 or 2 types. I have to say I'm really impressed with this course so far. I find it pretty straightforward. A little repetitive, but most of prepping is repetitive, and most of the information I knew, but some of it I did not. I am like you with the clips, seeing this for the first time. I actually purposefully haven't watched it. What I do is I video it, and then I go through it and find the segments I want to talk about that I think are good or I think are bad. I really am impressed. So next week, stay tuned, because it's the end of this chapter, chapter 2. Some of the things we're going to talk about: mental processing when facing disaster, a really important topic, the Joplin, Missouri tornado, shadow evacuations, and all hazards planning, in addition to other stuff. That's all for me. Toodles.
This has been a Sleepy Wolfie Terrier production, 2021.
Bit of a PSA here. In N95 we'll do. So even if it appears to be very minor and nothing much, just, hey, I'll get my film and I'll phone this,